The hill was low but steep. The wheels of the cart sank deep into the sand and jostled the only passenger, threatening to throw her to the road. She had no place to sit, her hands were tied, and a large hemp noose was around her neck. She wore only a simple dress of deerskin and a shawl of bird feathers and shells. Behind the wagon rode a young lieutenant on a house-drawn wagon, a shabby animal, but the best he could afford. He wore a simple woolen red uniform coat, the only ornamentation of which were 6 silver buttons. 2 laconic soldiers walked behind him as if on a walk on a warm spring day. The sky was overcast, and the Canarsie marshlands were damp with the foreboding of an impending thunderstorm. A small crowd had gathered at the top of the hill, where a crude scaffold had been erected from hewn logs. The crowd awaited the spectacle of the witch's execution. She had been tried and found guilty of consorting with the devil and practicing the black arts. She was nicknamed the bird that sits in the tree. The English called her the sparrow. She healed the sick among the poor when fever swept the eastern colony during the last outbreak. Apparently, this and her worship of the native gods was proof of her witchcraft. She was one of the last survivors of the Canarsie tribe, whose home was this land. Her native blood was the best proof of her guilt. The lieutenant was of Scottish descent. His name was James Wilson. He saw that Sparrow was only a girl, scarcely more than a child, and though she was clearly Indian in dress and appearance, she was not pure of blood. Nevertheless, she stood out from the group of ragamuffins on the hill. These colonists were a stern people. The preacher who condemned the witch and his family stood only half a step above the crowd. The wagon came to a creaking halt beneath the makeshift scaffold. The executioner fastened a noose on the rope. At that moment, the preacher, a tall, stubby fellow named Simon Pierce, stepped forward and asked the girl to repent of her sins for the sake of her immortal soul. The crowd murmured restlessly, but the girl did not waver. In clear, unaccented English, she said, "You have taken everything from us, our gods, our land, and now our lives, but it will all be returned, for the sea will rise and take it all away. On that day, you will pay for our blood, for it is my cur." Whatever else she had said was taken away, because whether she had planned it or not, the cart jerked forward, throwing Sparrow away, who gasped at the end of the rope. She growled, and her face went black. Her tongue stuck out, and she would have choked roughly if the officer hadn't jumped off his horse and grabbed her legs. With a sharp jerk, he pulled her down and snapped her neck, thus kindly ending the ghastly spectacle. As the crowd dispersed, the ditch diggers came forward. They were Paddy and Negra, and both had come to this so-called New World as slaves. Now formally free, they constituted the lowest caste of society living on starvation rations. Together with the officer and soldiers, they lowered Sparrow's body to the ground. James Wilson carried it to the foot of the hill where a grave had been dug. The preacher wanted to burn the body and scatter the ashes to the wind, but the colonel of the regiment refused, citing the high cost of firewood and the impossibility of igniting a sufficient flame in the swamp, sir. The grave was a good 6 feet deep, but because of the swampy soil, the bottom was filled with water. James thought quickly and, taking off his cloak, laid the dead girl on it. He then told his soldiers to gather some large stones. They placed the stones on the cloak under the girl's body, and he tied her into the cloak with the sleeves. James cut the buttons off the cloak, giving each of the men a button, and placed 2 over the girl's eyes, tying them with a linen neckerchief. From his pocket, he took out a wooden rosary, which he placed between the dead girl's fingers. Having thus arranged themselves, the 5 men solemnly lowered the corpse into the grave. Sparrow's body was submerged in the water until only her blindfolded head showed above the water. When they had finished, the 5 men bared their heads, and the lieutenant solemnly recited the Lord's Prayer. As he finished, he added words of warning as the wind picked up and the sky darkened with the approaching storm. "We pray that no one will disturb this grave with impunity, and that this child will sleep in the eternal rest of God's love. May the angels of the Lord our God watch over this place. Amen." As the men moved away from the grave, a large flock of birds took off. The birds took off in a huge winged spiral. They swept over the plain and disappeared. 2 weeks later, as the regiment was leaving for Albany to join General Prideaux in storming Fort Niagara, the colonel noticed that Lieutenant Wilson was wearing a new linen coat. Such an improvement over that Scotch woolen rag he was wearing, he told his camp adjutant. This was at the end of May, 1759. Next chapter. May 2019. "You can't build here," said civil engineer James Wilson, trying not to raise his voice. "Says who?" "I have a permit from the city," Harris Pierce told Wilson, his civil engineer, and thought he wouldn't have hired the man at all if it hadn't been for his attractive and obliging wife. Think with your head. The last hurricane flooded this entire area and destroyed 2 entire blocks of buildings 200 yards west of us. The next hurricane could do a lot more damage. Almost 100 years ago, there was a coastal marsh here that was filled with city trash. Waste is a bad filler. The ground has shrunk and sagged beneath our feet. Now we're standing a good 2 feet below sea level, but that level is rising. The only thing separating this construction site from the Atlantic Ocean is a ridge of sand. Every hurricane blows more sand away. Construction here is certain to cause property damage and take lives, hundreds or even thousands of lives. Harris was a tall, handsome man with a perky tongue and a way with the ladies, but he had no compassion for his neighbors or concern for other people's problems. It's none of our business. We got our permits. Wilson's frustration with the real estate developer had been growing since he took the job, but no sooner had he unleashed his anger than there was a shout nearby. An excavator was digging something up. They were standing on a relatively flat plain, slightly sunken in the center. When the city began to fill in the area, it had been leveled with a bulldozer. The national seashore began to the southwest, on firmer ground. That and the ocean view made the site as desirable as it was unsuitable. They were excavating for the foundation, trying to get to solid ground. An excavator uncovered bones. All work immediately stopped. The curious stood around gawking, and the supervisors looked warily into the ditch. "This could be a crime scene," Tom Munson said hopefully to Harris Pierce. Munson was the construction superintendent, and Pierce was the developer. Jake Clinton was the excavator, and engineer Wilson was a partner in the venture. He was a large, handsome man, and in his 50s was still capable of arousing interest in the opposite sex. "From your mouth to God's ear," said Jake Clinton, unearthing the bones. Jake worked alone, enlisting help only as needed. He converted an old garage in Flatlands into a home for his excavation equipment. He had a good reputation, especially among women. Although he was proud of his African ancestry, he preferred his ladies to be natural blondes. Mrs. Wilson was very light and in all the right places. The option that the bones belonged to the killer was almost unbearable. An archaeological dig could drag on for years over a vast area, while the cops would confine themselves to the burial site and clean up in a few weeks. "Come on in, Tim, and tell us what you see," Harris said. Tim Watson was Munson's assistant, more of an assistant than a second assistant. He was an awkward young man of about 25 who usually went unnoticed except when unpleasant work needed to be done. He was known for tripping over his own feet when a beautiful woman was around. Mrs. Wilson was more than beautiful. "She's so pretty," Tim purred. Tim carefully and reluctantly climbed into the hole. As soon as he entered the trench, a dark cloud seemed to obscure the sun. Looking up, Wilson saw that it was not a cloud, but a huge flock of birds, hundreds of birds circling and spinning in a huge spiraling mass. Maybe 1,000 individuals, moving as if with a single consciousness. They rose and fell on a wind that only they felt, as if guided by some ghostly spirit. "Don't touch anything," Bob Munson demanded of Tim. "Just watch." "I don't see anything dark," Tim said, but bent down to take a closer look. The bones seemed to be covered in some kind of cloth. "Could be recent," Harris Pierce said. "Call 911 and report it. In the meantime, move the equipment to the other side. We'll dig there," he ordered Jake Clinton. The police were slow to respond to the call, and it was hours before a patrol car showed up. 2 bored officers wrapped yellow tape around the perimeter of the crime scene. By then, The sun was beginning to dip behind the city to the west. James Wilson returned home as the spring afternoon gave way to night. He was late, as usual, but he was not surprised to find the house dark and empty. His house in Mill Basin was overbuilt, taking up the entire narrow lot to accommodate a two-story, four-bedroom house. The brick facade concealed the wood frame of the house, built in the late 20th century. His realtor wife described the house in an indeterminate English style as a Tudor colonial. He had to take her word for it. Kathy was a highly successful realtor with her own Century 21 franchise. Kathy was out again, and Jimmy couldn't remember the current excuse for her absence, or rather, couldn't be bothered to remember the current untruth. Kathy was a tall, blue-eyed blonde who never failed to turn heads when she entered the room. When it came to wives, Kathy was in the 99th percentile for love, affection, and beauty. She was good-natured and considerate. In bed, she was a tigress who never let her spouse go unsatisfied and fulfilled his desires. In short, she was everything a husband could ask for, as long as he didn't mind light flirting with other men and was deaf, dumb, and blind enough not to notice that the flirting was far from light and went far beyond infidelity. She was always sorry, remorseful, and tormented by guilt, but could never keep her promise to never go beyond another seduction again. Kathy was a woman with a problem that seemed to encompass most of the male gender. Jimmy lost count of how many times he had forgiven her. He no longer tried to identify her infidelities and only noticed them when they invaded his personal space. There were the lovers who blamed him for the end of the affair, and the jerks who flaunted their conquest of his wife. All of these misguided souls regretted meeting a big, powerful engineer who was trained in jiu-jitsu. The worst part of these awkward encounters were the tears Kathy shed on her way to forgiveness and the next affair. He barely had time to turn on the light when the phone rang. It was Harris Pierce, and between swear words he mustered an explanation that police technicians had arrived on the scene and were urgently calling their archaeologist. The bones were old, very old. Next chapter. The day was sunny, with a light breeze off the water. Such a late May day allowed one to hope that summer, with its heat and humidity, would never come. It was 7 in the morning when Jim turned off Belt Parkway and headed southeast through the wetlands toward the construction site. The only member of the crew to arrive this early was Jake Clinton, and he was grumpily gathering his equipment. "Good morning, Jake," he said. "Nothing good," Jake replied. "They were here when I got here," he said, nodding his head toward the group near the dig site. "5 pixies with a hard-ass Indian bitch in charge," Jake said, and then when Jim grimaced, added, "Oh, sorry, 5 metrosexuals and a Native American bitch in charge." Jake looked more hostile than the site's closure warranted, but the reason soon became obvious. Laura Brandt was a short, raven-haired beauty. The copper hue of her skin was extremely attractive, and a fire burned in her large dark eyes that promised predatory encounters that, judging by the serious grin on her shoulder, she was unwilling to provide. "Before you ask, I don't know how long it's going to take," she said when she saw Jim, with icy contempt. No wonder Jake, who had never met a beautiful woman he didn't want to entertain, ruffled his feathers. "As much time as you need," Jim said. "As much as you want." As he turned to leave, she apparently couldn't resist. "Maybe we will." Jim smiled at her as he walked away. The surveyors showed up. They had been contracted weeks before to take the measurements needed to map the property. Jim had assigned them the job. Whether or not the project went forward, and he was sure it would sooner or later, the map was going to come in handy. Other workers began to arrive, mostly to clean up the site and close it down while the historical work was being done. Since neither Pierce nor Munson showed up, Jim was in charge of the site. When Tim Watson showed up, he had a dejected look. "Don't be discouraged," Jim told him. "There are better places to be. We just need to find them." As Tim left, he seemed to grumble something about a woman, and Jim thought, "I guess he must have missed again." In the absence of the senior partners, Jim was in charge of the precinct. So Jim was completely absorbed in his work and had almost forgotten about the historical diggers on the other side of the plain. He was leaning over a steel barrel on which lay a piece of plywood that had been turned into a rough table when he heard her voice behind him. I came to apologize. I was rather rude, but I thought you were making fun of me. When I questioned the other workers, they said you were against building here. May I know why? She said. It's simple. We stand below sea level, and there's only a narrow ridge of sand between us and the ocean. How old are you? She hesitated, not understanding why he was asking, then answered, 28? Before you turn 50, this land will go underwater. Every great storm can flood this coast, destroying buildings and drowning their inhabitants. Only the ignorant will live here, and only greedy fools will build here. I see, she said. By the way, I'm Laura Brandt, Deputy Director of the Eastern Native Archaeological Preservation Project. Most people call it ENAP. She held out her hand. He started to take her small hand in his large one, but she finished the introduction for him. You're James Wilson, a civil engineer known as Big Jim because of your height, 6 feet 8 inches. That's impressive. No, just unusual. Would you like some hot coffee? We have some in the trailer. Yeah, I wouldn't say no. It was cold when I got here this morning, but I expected it to warm up, which it did, but just a little bit, she said, as they started walking toward the trailer on the northwest corner of the construction site. The distance was no more than 100 yards. The site was about a mile wide and half a mile deep. The bones were found a little west and south of the center of the site. There was something about her appearance that brought a smile to his face and heart. He wanted to hear her laugh and laugh with her. As they walked, they talked. Do a lot of women do archaeology? He asked. More than you think, but before you ask, I only have men on my team because I'm sexist. Men! He stopped with his hand on the trailer door handle when she said that, and turned just in time to catch her laugh. It was a pleasant laugh, deep and free and unaffected. Sorry, I couldn't resist, but there's some truth to it. Boys are good at playing in the mud, girls not so much. I knew it was going to be a mud job. That's why I brought the boys along. You can say that again. How are you going to handle the water? He asked, as they entered the construction office. Pumps and filters to catch everything in the water. The dirt is another story. We can try freezing it so we can cut it out in blocks. I'd like to see that, he said. Feel free to come and observe. He invited her to sit at a small table and brought her coffee cups. Any idea what you have here? He asked, pouring the coffee. She took a black coffee with lots of sugar. She held the cup with the hot contents, warming her hands as she answered. I don't like to speculate, but I think there's something there, if it's not what we first hoped. He didn't press her, but let her speak out. The bones are definitely hers, and she's part Aboriginal, which is why they called us. However, the place is confusing. Preliminary evidence suggests there's a mix of native and European elements. I think she's from the 18th century, but why she's buried here and in this form will be hard to determine, if we do it at all. So it will probably take you a long time. No, I doubt that. We'll dig some trenches to make sure it's an isolated grave and that there are no structures nearby, but it looks like she was buried alone. However, tell me, if you are so against building here, then why continue with this project? Work is hard to find, and I got involved before I realized what was being planned. Is money so hard to turn down? She asked. Yes and no. My wife is very successful. I don't have to earn it for a living, and sometimes I think she would be perfectly happy if I did nothing. On the other hand, she has put her money into this project, and I don't want to lose it for her. I've heard your wife is attractive, but I gather she's also rich. Rich is what she would say. As a realtor, she makes 4 times as much as a civil engineer, he said, looking at Laura. He knew that wasn't all she'd heard about his wife, but he didn't want to find out what the builders had said about Kathy's reputation. Laura must have sensed what he was thinking because she turned the conversation to her digs. It's an interesting place. She was small, like me, and mixed race. You can tell from the bones, and we found an almost complete skeleton, so the forensic pathologists may well be able to give a cause of death. She was wearing deerskin clothing and a shawl of feathers and shells, suggesting a shaman in the case of a man and possibly a healer in the case of a woman. Confusingly, she was wrapped in an unusual woolen garment. The wool was very dense and too coarse for a modern fiber, but the buttons on the skull and the remnants of the linen cloth wrapped around it are what are disconcerting, and the prayer rosary clearly indicates European influence, she finished pondering. Sounds like you have some work to do. Yeah, I'll be up to my ears in mud all day and researching all night. Research? We'll have to see if I can track her down in the historical records. There's a lot of odds, but sometimes they pay off. Finishing their coffee, they left the trailer as the sky overhead darkened. Birds again, he said. Sparrows, she replied. But there are so many of them. It seems to have doubled in number as of late. They were here when we started digging this morning. It's like they're watching us. It's a little disconcerting, but maybe that's what I expected from European invaders, she smirked. What? Sparrows are a European species. You don't see the native ones here anymore, she said. They were brought into Central Park in the 19th century, and now they've taken it over. Next chapter. That evening, Kathy was home and bustling with life. He didn't need to explain that this meant having a new man in her life, probably a married man, staying home with his wife on a weeknight. Beloved, I'm so glad to see you. I've missed my older companion, but you know that yourself. Well, no business tonight. I've ordered dinner delivery from Manzano's, everything you like, Kathy announced. She was a beautiful woman. It was unfortunate that so many men had already turned to the devil to give Kathy a second chance. If women could bewitch men, Kathy was the ultimate sorceress. He let her drag herself into their bedroom. I ordered delivery for 8. We'll have an hour and a half to play, she said. Next chapter. The call came early in the morning as Wilson prepared to leave for his new job. He hadn't been in Canarsie in almost a week. He'd stopped by Laura Brandt's house more to say hello than to observe her digging. She had a fairly substantial site but was winding down the project. He said, "Required on the site at Canarsie immediately." When Wilson arrived at the site, the yellow tape had already returned, and with it, the New York City police officers. What happened? He asked the officer who seemed to be in charge. Who are you? Engineer James Wilson, and technically I'm in charge of the site while we're suspended from the archaeological dig. The detectives will want to talk to you. Eventually, 2 plainclothes detectives led him to the office trailer. They introduced themselves as Lenny Crawford and Sarah Jenner. Crawford appeared to be the lead investigator. He did most of the questioning. When was the last time you saw Jake Clinton? Demanded Crawford. I don't know. Maybe a week or so ago. Why? We're asking questions, put in Jenner. Both she and Crawford looked hostile. Do you know of any reason why he might have been here last night? Asked Crawford. No, as far as I can tell. He was in charge of the excavation work, but it was suspended. He moved all his equipment out a few weeks ago. He was your partner, wasn't he? Asked Crawford, as if he had caught Wilson in a lie. Only in a sense. We both had a stake in this construction project. Doesn't his death increase your share? I don't know. Wait a minute, are you saying he's dead? He's lying face down in that ditch they were digging, with the back of his head crushed, Crawford said, and after a pause asked, Where were you last night? At home. Can anyone confirm that? No, I was alone. Aren't you married? My wife was on a business trip. Does she go away a lot? She's a realtor and very busy. From what I understand, she knew Mr. Clinton very well. Close, you might say. She knows a lot of people. They asked many more questions. It was obvious that they had suspicions about Wilson. But the last question, asked casually by Jenner as she left, gave Wilson a chill, and he couldn't say why. Do you know of any reason why Clinton would have feathers in his hand? What? Feathers, like a bird's. And they barely had time to leave before Laura knocked on the trailer door. Once inside, she immediately pounced on it. They toasted you too. They acted like I killed him. Yeah, I'm in the 3rd degree. They assumed I did it for the money or because he was dating my wife. Was he dating her? She asked, frowning. I don't know. I try not to know. I understand, she said in a tone that clearly said he wasn't. It's not what you think it is. She's a complicated woman. I don't doubt it, Laura said, meaning the opposite. He saw that he had no chance of explaining the situation to Laura and that there was no way to overcome her disapproval. He shrugged and continued. What do we think of the dig? That brought a smile to her face. We got a little lucky. One chance in a million, you might say. It's in Freeman's journal, or at least its death and burial. What is Freeman's journal? Abraham Freeman was born in Africa. As a child, he was brought by Dutch traders to New York City, where he was sold into slavery to a printer. While working in the printer's shop, he learned to read and write. When the printer died, his widow, a Quaker woman, freed Abraham. For a time, he had to make a living as best he could. One of his occupations was gravedigger. Now here's the most interesting part. Once free, he kept a diary of his experiences. He describes the hanging of an accused witch on a hill southeast of the village of Flatlands. He describes the execution and subsequent burial. And you think this is the same grave we found here? Asked Wilson. He describes being buried in a woolen coat, and the silver buttons from the coat were split in two above the girl's eyes. That's too close for a mere coincidence. Well, I'd say you found the answers to your questions. Yes, but this place becomes important because of the date. It happened in 1759. The execution of witches was stopped by an Act of Parliament in 1735. This proves that the practice of condemning witches continued in the colonies after it ended in Europe. Well, you've made an important find. I'm happy for you. Saying this, Wilson was about to turn away, but not before she threw herself into his arms and kissed him. Caught off guard, Wilson returned the kiss, but when they parted, he grabbed her hands. What are you doing? I'm a married man! A flash of anger flashed across her face. Indeed. You need to take a good look at yourself. Everyone knows what your wife is and what she does. Pretending otherwise is just silly. Laura pulled out of his arms and ran out of the trailer. He didn't follow her. Something the detectives had said kept him wondering. How did Jake's death affect the partnership? He knew who might have the answer. He called Katie. She answered on the sixth ring, just before the voicemail went to voicemail. She panted as she took the call and whispered, "What's up, my husband?" Was there something in her voice, or was it just her heavy breathing that told him he'd caught her in bed with another man? Jake Clinton is dead, he informed her. I heard. I'm sorry, but don't let that upset you, she replied. The police seem to think I had a motive to kill him. Really? She said, feigning surprise. Wilson played along. Yes, they mentioned a partnership among other motives. Uh-oh, that, I guess. Yeah, I guess the surviving partners will get in on his share. There's insurance to pay his beneficiaries. But he only had 10%, which is hardly a motive for murder. Someone was beside her, and that someone had informed her of Clinton's murder. She was well aware that the obvious motive for Jake Clinton's death was an angry husband or boyfriend. In other words, Kathy Wilson's husband. He wondered if replacing Clinton with the man now lying in Kathy's bed would divert the detective's suspicions. He decided to drop the bombshell and see what would happen. Well, partnership is not a motive because these archaeologists have found something big that will delay this project for years. Silence reigned on the other end. Finally, he said, I'll call you back later. About a half hour later, Harris Pierce burst into the trailer. What the hell is going on here? He shouted. Besides the murder, nothing. We're closed, remember? Wilson replied calmly. Yeah, but how long is all this going to go on? No, worrying about Jake is understandable. What? You want me to cry for the ditch digger? Pierce said. You're crying for him. You seem to be good at it. And I've got condos to build. Money was Pierce's concern. To start, he envisioned building 100 condominiums. Jim Wilson knew from experience that Harris expected a profit of $200,000 per unit, or about $20 million. He was the controlling partner, owning more than 50% of the stock. The other senior partner was Munson with 23%. Jake owned 10% before his death, and the remaining 16% was owned by Kathy and Jim Wilson. Theoretically, Jim could have received, along with his wife, over $3 million. However, he viewed these profits as blood money and was sure that if anything went wrong, and he was sure it would, Wilson, as engineer, would be responsible. Harris Pierce would claim that he didn't know of any dangers, and Jim was sure that Pierce was already gathering forged evidence that would show his total innocence. But on top of that, Jim was sure that Harris was having fun with Jim's wife. He wasn't a vindictive man, but now he was determined to make sure Harris got what he deserved. You should contact the parties holding up the work. First to the police, and then to the archaeologist. Harris didn't want to deal with the police any further than he already had. The motives attributed to Jim suited him equally well. Jim wasn't surprised when he headed over to where Laura was supervising the packing of the artifacts discovered so far. Laura and her team had erected a large tent with a series of small fences inside it. The police had stopped the pumps, and the ditch was already filling with groundwater. She thought about the fact that these must have been the conditions under which the burial must have taken place. Water was seeping into the grave, so the body had been wrapped in an officer's coat and weighted down. The special properties of the coat of coarse wool and the muddy ground preserved it, but it must have been a poor garment in its day. Abraham Freeman noted in his diary that all the soldiers, including the officer, spoke a strange English and sometimes switched to another language, which Paddy, an Irishman, said was a type of Old Language, Gaelic. Each time she searched, she found a new clue to the past, but each answer raised new questions. The buttons had been embossed with a crude X, she thought, but now she realized it was a saltire or cross of St. Andrew. The coat and buttons had come from Scotland. The expert she had consulted had spoken at length about how Scottish lads had been recruited into the British Army from a country plundered into poverty after the ill-fated rebellion led by the man known to history as Bonnie Prince Charlie. "What does it all mean?" she asked herself as Pierce burst in on her and demanded when she was done. She turned to face him in a full-throated 100 pounds of pure rage. "Don't you realize she was murdered?" Laura said, pointing to the sturdy metal crates that now held the remains. Under the pressure of her anger, Pierce took a step backward, right at Jim Wilson, who had followed him out of the trailer. Turning, he saw the anger and hatred in the man's eyes. "What's wrong with you?" wheezed Pierce. The man was a full head taller and looked ready to kill. "You amuse my wife and ask me what's wrong." At that moment, the birds attacked. There were more sparrows, and their aggressiveness had clearly increased. They swooped down on the trio standing outside the tent in such numbers that the men were forced to retreat into the tent. "What the hell is going on?" Pierce said, his voice one level below a scream. It sounded like something out of a Hitchcock movie, but the birds didn't press their attack. They rose into the air in a spiral and seemed to disappear like a rain cloud parting to let the sunlight in. Pierce moved away quickly, but not without Munson and his assistant Tim seeing a close confrontation. "What could Katie Wilson possibly see in him?" said Tim, but Munson couldn't figure out which man he was talking about. Like everyone else, the awkward aide was partial to the delightful Kathy. That afternoon, the news trucks arrived in time for the evening broadcast. Attracted by the murder, they stayed to tell the story of the Indian burial ground and its resident sorcerer. The story took the top spot on the local news. Next chapter. It was a large crowd, over 200 people. They were ostensibly peaceful, but they were loud in their protest and definitely hostile. They blocked the roadway and pushed back police barriers. The police retreated to the construction fences. Jim slipped inside on the ocean side and immediately went in search of Laura. She was in the tent, where he assumed she had spent the night guarding her precious artifacts. What could they possibly want? He asked when he found Laura. The usual. We desecrate graves, disrespect Native American culture, and participate in the oppression of Native peoples by whites. Oh, you've seen this before. Not in an urban setting like this. Usually excavations take place outside of the city, and it's much harder to gather such a large crowd, she said, and then sighed. The only thing you can do is try to wait it out. I wouldn't dare move artifacts through a crowd. A police lieutenant entered the tent, walked over to Laura, and taking off his hat said, "We're managing to contain the crowd, but only temporarily. I thought maybe you could talk to the leaders." Laura sighed and dutifully followed the lieutenant to the exit. Jim followed, feeling a growing uneasiness about the situation. The trench was already almost completely filled with murky black water. The engineer at Wilson knew this was a bad sign. The water table was high, and the ground beneath his feet was an unstable suspension of sand and city waste. 4 protesters were allowed into the dig site. A tall, thin man in a leather vest and fringed leather pants, a tall black woman in an African print dress, a short, curvy, red-headed girl of about 17, and a young Latino man in blue jeans and a plain white t-shirt. "Hello, Chief Red Cloud," Laura addressed the tall, thin man, who was clearly the leader or chief instigator, depending on one's point of view. "This is Simon Red Cloud, and as you know, chief is a derogatory term. But I'm glad to see you, Laura, even if it's only to get you to stop desecrating the graves of your people." "Still selling the same misconceptions to the ignorant," Laura said with a sigh, and walked toward the rest of the group. "This is not a sacred burial ground. There is only one grave here, and yet it can tell us an important story if you look closely and listen. She was a healer who was executed by the ignorant people of this place. In a sense, she was killed for a good deed. But then she was buried by 5 men, none of whom came here willingly. 2 of them had been brought here as slaves. One was an African," Laura said, turning to the woman sitting behind her. "Another was Irish," she said, turning to the small red-haired girl. "The other 3 are Scots who were forced to serve the army that oppressed them and brought to this foreign country that must have seemed the ends of the earth to them." She paused to make sure she had their attention. They laid her on this damp earth, wrapped in a woolen army coat. They attached silver buttons to her eyes. She lifted a button for all to see. "It shows a saltire, the flag of Scotland, probably an act of defiance on an English army coat. They put it in the ground here and said a simple prayer over it," she said, turning to the ditch she had dug, which was now filled with water. Spreading her arms wide, she said, "This is the story I was called to find and tell." At that moment, thousands of birds took to the air, swooping and circling. The red-haired girl screamed, and a body floated out of the depths of the ditch. Next chapter. "I tell you, I have no idea who could have wanted to kill Harris Pierce," James Wilson declared. He was in a room in the police station. The room was painted a disgusting green color, and he himself was sitting at a desk that looked like it had been bought at Goodwill. "You mean to say that you have no motive for destroying the man who entertained your wife and whose death cut off a large chunk of your $20 million? It was Sergeant Sarah Jenner who asked the question now. She dropped the pretense that Detective Crawford was in charge. "You're wrong on both counts of the indictment. To begin with, the plot is unsuitable. That's why there's no $20 million profit. And as for my wife, she knows a lot of men. Remember, she was the motive for the murder of Jake Clinton that you named." "Yes, and Harris Pierce's alibi in that murder was none other than your wife. Who told us she spent the whole night with Pierce?" "Well, doesn't that tell you anything? Only a madman would try to kill all my wife's lovers." "It's very convenient to play the willing cuckold, but you have a long list of convictions," Jenner said, placing a printout on the table. "I've never been convicted of any crime." "But you've been charged with assault 7 times. You've put 2 men in the hospital. It seems you can get pretty angry at those who frequent your wife's bed." "All of those charges were dropped." "Yes, your wife took care of them for you. Convinced her lovers to leave. And how do you think she did that?" "You looked at the body, Detective Jenner," demanded a frustrated Jim. "You, like your girlfriend, subscribe to the boogeyman theory. The corpse was ripped open. It had the claw marks of some kind of animal on it." "Very convenient. You'll have to tell me how you did it. It was Laura's idea to blame it on some ancient spirit." "Why would she want to kill Pierce?" To stop the construction project. That's what the argument was about. There was no argument. Pierce was angry because he wanted to finish the dig, but the construction project was already dead. The ground wouldn't support it. That's not what Mr. Munson says. He's going ahead, Jenner replied. Well, why don't you question him? He's gotten a lot more than I have. Mr. Manson and especially his assistant have been very helpful to us. They told us that you were only involved in this project because of your wife, and you resented her and Mr. Pierce. So why kill Jake? To weave this Indian ghost story. Clinton dug up the bones, and as Miss Brandt knows, Pierce is a descendant of one of the men who helped put those bones there, just like you. What? So your new girlfriend didn't tell you that when she talked you into killing Clinton and Pierce? The interrogation went on all day and well past midnight, but eventually Jim had to be released. Kathy provided him with an alibi, and Laura could not have committed the crime alone. Once free, Wilson went straight to Canarsie. He found Laura in the main tent near the artifacts. She was unfolding her sleeping bag, clearly intending to stay the night. Do you have room for two? He asked. What are you doing here? It's not safe, is it? What makes you think a ghost would take me? He asked with a laugh. It's not a joke. There's something strange going on here. It's a very strange coincidence that one of the dead men is related to the principle of execution, and the other dead man is the one who first disturbed the grave. Laura, you're a scientist. How can you believe in ghosts? There are too many oddities and coincidences, like you, James Wilson, who died by the man who wrapped her in his coat, and Pierce, who helped kill her. The Pierce family, I admit, has lived here since before the American Revolution. But you're wrong about me. My great-great-grandfather arrived with his sister on a ship from Ireland at the beginning of the potato famine. His mother died on the ship crossing the Atlantic, and his father died in Ireland before they sailed. Left without parents, the children were placed in a Catholic orphanage run by nuns. The girl did well in school, but the boy ran away. He eventually made his way here to Canarsie and was taken in by a pig farmer named Wilson, whose last name he took. So you see, I had nothing to do with this grave, he finished, and moved toward it, towering over it. The spirit may not be that knowledgeable about your lineage, she said, looking into his deep blue eyes. But she must know who is digging into her bones. You're the one who isn't safe. I must stay here to protect the artifacts until we can move them. Red Cloud's men can take them. I will stay with them until I am sure they are safe. And I'll stay with you until I know you're safe. Why, James? What am I to you? Don't play games with me. I know you felt it from the first day we met. I get enough deception at home. I don't need deception from you. Then lay it all out in the open. What did you feel, and what do you feel now? This, he answered, enclosing her in his arms. There were no more words between them. They took their time. They slowly climbed under the bedclothes she had spread out. Next chapter. Good morning, he smiled. Then she said, We can't stay here forever. I know, but what do I tell my wife? He said, bringing some reality into the tent in between them. She recoiled from him, a look of bewilderment on her face. Tell her goodbye, she said. I can't. Not just like that. I don't want to hurt her. Hurt her. That unrepentant whore. The question is why you stayed with her. You don't realize she can't help herself. It's an addiction. Fine, she's an addict. You can't help an addict. Staying with her only prevents her from facing the consequences of her actions. You may be right, but... Choose, she demanded, rising to her feet. It's either her or me. He never got to choose, for at that moment the tent flaps opened and Detective Jenner ushered in a squad of policemen. James Wilson and Sarah Brandt, I'm placing you under arrest for the murders of Jake Clinton, Harris Pierce, and Thomas Munson. Munson? They both said. Jenner smirked back. You'd be a lot more convincing if his body hadn't been found torn to pieces 24 miles from here. Next chapter. The bail hearing was brief and to the point. The prosecutor wanted to lock them deep in the bowels of the Brooklyn Detention Center, but defense attorneys convinced the judge, after all, there was no direct evidence yet, and bail was granted. Kathy paid for Jim, and Laura's employer paid for her. On the courthouse steps, Kathy hugged Jim, kissing him and telling him she forgave him. "It's not your fault. She bewitched you. We didn't kill anyone. I didn't kill anyone. She didn't kill anybody," stated Wilson, and seeing Laura leaving the courthouse, called out to her. Laura didn't turn around and didn't acknowledge him. She was with a group of well-dressed people who he assumed belonged to the program she worked for. Laura got into a town car parked at the curb, and the group drove off. "You need to stay away from Miss Brandt," the lawyer instructed. "Why? It's not like we did anything." The lawyer sighed disappointedly and said, "It doesn't matter what you did. What matters is what the prosecutor says. It's an unequal system. The prosecution usually wins, right or wrong. Right now, you and Miss Brandt are the only suspects. One of you will be convicted of these crimes. Let's try to make sure it's not you." Next chapter. Jim had been driving for hours. The confrontation with Kathy was not a pleasant one. She didn't understand why he was leaving her. "It's all about that Indian bitch," she accused. "Only partly, I can't take it anymore. Each of your cheating hurts worse than the last. Clinton, Pierce, Manson, and whoever else, it goes on and on. It just never ends. But I'm going to stop. I promise there won't be anything else. It'll just be the two of us." "No, you say that too often. I don't believe you can change anymore." "Please," she begged, crying and clinging to him as he left the house. She collapsed in the doorway as he drove away. He drove for hours. He stopped for dinner and gas and then drove some more. He was told not to drive to see her, but he couldn't and wouldn't take that advice. Finally, he gave up and headed to Canarsie, to the dig site. He knew that was where he would find her, the true love of his life. The only question was, did she love him? It was already 2 o'clock in the morning. Jim could see a campfire south of the parkway at the southern end of the archaeological site. He turned off the road and drove back down the service road until he was parallel to the dig. He turned his Toyota pickup truck south, staying far west of the excavation. By the light of a campfire, he saw a Subaru SUV half hidden by deep weeds. He parked the car about 10 feet behind the Subaru and walked to where a silhouette was visible in the firelight. Laura sat staring into the fire, as if in a trance, but turned as he approached. "I see you are not afraid of ghosts," she said. "I don't believe in them," he answered. "Neither do 3 dead men." He only hummed in response and motioned for the crate to sit down. Laura sat cross-legged on the bare ground, wearing a deerskin dress and her hair braided. She began to hum softly, as if putting herself into a trance. "So I know if we're expecting a ghost?" he asked. "You need to be quiet. You've read Abraham Freeman's story. Your ancestor cursed those who disturbed Sparrow's grave. We must appease the spirits of the dead." "And the living?" he inquired. "I think they should work out their own problems." I detect a note of judgment. "Why should I judge you for being faithful to your tramp wife?" she said with obvious sarcasm. "Yes, I realize you disapprove, but you must have some compassion." "What now? You want my pity?" "Not for me, but for Katie. She can't help what she is, and it hurts her more than anyone else." "You, James Wilson, you idiot," Laura said, jumping to her feet and pointing a finger in his face. "That woman doesn't love you, never has and never will." "I understand," he said, "but you love me." And seizing her, he drew her to him and kissed her. She tried to resist, but only toppled them both to the sand. They struggled for a while before passion took over, and they fell into a mutual embrace. When they finally broke the embrace, she said, "What should I do? I love you. What should I do?" "Well, for one thing, you should know all the facts. I'm not related to that Wilson guy, remember?" "No, you are related. Your great-great-grandfather married a farmer's daughter, and she was the great-granddaughter of a Scottish army officer who was wounded at the Battle of Fort Niagara and discharged when his regiment returned to New York. You see, I've tracked you down. I see. Then I have a ghost to watch out for, he said with a laugh. I'm going to take care of it, she said. And how are you going to do that? I brought dry wood and a can of syrup. I've been stoking the fire all night to get it hot enough to burn the bones, she said. Are you going to destroy them? It is the custom of her people. They lay the body on the ground for a year on a hide stretched between poles. When the first spring comes after that year, they remove the body, clean the bones, and burn them to ashes, which they scatter on the ground. I will burn her bones and scatter the ashes to free her from this world. You're serious, he said. As proof, she tossed more wood into the fire and watched it flare up. Okay, where are the bones? He asked. You're sitting on them. He stood up and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in birch bark, lay the bones in 3 bundles. Laura walked over and took one bundle from the crate. She placed it on the fire and spoke a few words in a language he did not understand. What did you say? It is a prayer asking her heavenly mother to guide her spirit to the next world. It was almost dawn when the last roll was burned by the flames. Jim put his arms around Laura from behind and pulled her close as they watched the fire burn to ashes. He kissed her neck and was about to kiss her again, but not before he was stopped. What was that? He asked, half expecting a ghost to emerge from the thicket of weeds to his right. But then Tim Watson appeared with a gun in one hand and a hammer in the other. I hate to interrupt this case, Watson said with obvious sarcasm in his voice. Now if you two will move toward that lovely ditch you dug. What's going on, Tim? Asked Wilson. You're an engineer, Jim. You know how to solve problems and can probably figure this out, Tim scoffed. You're a ghost, said Laura. But why? Because he wants Katie, said Jim. Bingo! I knew you'd guess that. He's going to kill us over that slut, Laura protested. Watch your mouth, bitch, Watson said, waving his gun around. Jim started laughing, backing away from the ditch. See, he wants her, so he's eliminating the competition. You don't deserve her, Watson said, taking a step closer. How wrong the detectives are. This isn't about money, it's about lust. Still, why kill me? I'm only a cuckolded husband. She doesn't want to leave you. She says she loves you, but it is me she must love. A man who really loves her? But she'll realize that when you're gone. She has a funny way of showing her love for her husband. What makes you think you'll have a better one? Added Laura. Nobody asked for your opinion, bitch, Tim said, his hands starting to shake. To Jim, Timothy Watson seemed like a man who had lost his grip on reality. If he thought he could keep a woman like Kathy by eliminating the competition, he was either crazy or potentially the greatest mass murderer in history, or maybe both. We're heading for the ditch. Move, said Watson, pointing the gun ominously. And if we refuse? Asked Jim. Then I'll shoot her first. Laura took a step forward. Go ahead. But Jim stopped her. Do as he says. Okay, but I have a question, said Laura. How did you get the other one to come here? Watson laughed. That was easy. I wrote to them pretending to be Kathy and suggested they meet here to avoid her jealous husband. They couldn't get here fast enough. More questions, he smirked. Yeah, does she make you all stupid or does she only pick stupid men? They were facing east, and Tim had his back to the horizon, over which the first rays of summer dawn were rising. Sparrows were rising from the ground to begin their morning flight. There were only a few at first, but soon hundreds would be swooping and circling near the western edge of the trench. Jim led them sideways, waiting for his chance. It came as dawn broke, the flock swept low over them, and suddenly the birds soared downward. Watson ducked, and Jim, who had been waiting for this moment, pounced upon him. They struggled for the gun, and a shot rang out. The two men separated, and for a moment Laura could not realize whom she had hit, but then Watson staggered and fell to the ground. The next instant, she had her arms around Jim and was crying. It's all right now. The sparrows saved us. No, she said. Look what has grown. She was covered in feathers, and in the light of the early morning, he saw that they were a different shade. Those are the feathers of the American sparrow, not the feathers of the European sparrow. She saved us. The sparrow saved us. The little bird that sits in the tree, the American tree sparrow. Jim looked up, but the birds were already gone. He looked in all directions, but there were no birds. Heavenly Mother sent them to see her off to the next world, Laura said solemnly. At that moment, the engineer could not argue with her, for the wind had picked up and spread the ashes from the fire over the damp earth, and he knew very well that the land would soon go under water, just as the sparrow had predicted. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.